January 1944. A frozen airfield somewhere in western Germany. Dawn comes slowly, a pale light spreading across snow-packed runways and rows of camouflaged fighters. Mechanics stand motionless, hands buried in coats stiff with oil and cold. In the distance, engines cough to life. Above them, contrails already scar the sky. Inside a briefing hut, Luftwaffe pilots study a chalkboard crowded with numbers, sortie counts, loss ratios, production estimates pulled from intelligence reports. The figures don't make sense. They're checked again and again. Across the channel, the Americans are not just building aircraft, they are producing them at a rhythm no Air Force has ever faced. One heavy bomber, completed roughly every hour, day and night, week after week. For the German aces, men who once dominated European skies through skill and experience, this is something entirely new. Not a tactical problem, not a technological surprise, but an industrial one. They have fought enemies before. They have never fought a factory. And as the distant thunder of engines grows louder overhead, it becomes clear that the war in the air is no longer being decided solely by who flies better, but by who can replace losses faster than the sky can consume them. That realization leads directly to how the world arrived at this moment.
Long before American bombers filled European skies, the idea that wars could be decided from the air was still unproven. In the aftermath of the First World War, air power theorists on both sides of the Atlantic argued fiercely about the future. Some believed aircraft would merely support armies on the ground. Others insisted that modern wars would be won by striking an enemy's industry, transportation, and morale directly, far behind the front lines. In the United States, one of the loudest voices belonged to Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. He argued that bombers, if built in sufficient numbers and properly protected, could cripple a nation's ability to fight. His ideas were controversial, often ridiculed, sometimes punished, but they lingered. Across the ocean, Germany took a different path. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, rearmament followed quickly. The Luftwaffe was built for speed and aggression. Its doctrine emphasized tactical bombing, close air support, and fighter dominance. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt B-109 and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka were designed to work alongside fast-moving ground forces in Poland, in France. In the early months of the war, it worked. The Luftwaffe crushed opponents through coordination and skill. Pilots became aces. Experience mattered. Individual ability mattered. Victory in the air seemed personal. Strategic bombing, long-range, high-altitude attacks on factories and cities was ignored, but it was not central to German planning. Heavy bombers were expensive, complex, slow to build. Germany's industrial base, already stretched, could not easily support mass production on the scale required. Britain, by contrast, learned harsh lessons early. After suffering daylight losses in 1939 and 1940, the Royal Air Force shifted to night bombing. The goal was survival, not precision. Area bombing became policy. It was a grim adaptation, born of necessity. The United States watched all of this from across the Atlantic. Before December 1941, America was officially at peace, but it was not idle. The U.S. Army Air Corps studied European battles closely. Reports from Britain were analyzed line by line: loss rates, formation tactics, defensive gun placements. The Americans reached a bold conclusion. Daylight precision bombing could work if aircraft were heavily armed, flown in tight formations, and built in overwhelming numbers. This belief led directly to the development of aircraft like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. 4 engines, high ceilings, bristling with machine guns, designed not just to bomb, but to fight their way to the target and back. Still, in 1940 and early 1941, this remained theory. American industry was powerful, but it was not yet mobilized for total war. Aircraft production existed, but nothing close to what was coming. Many factories were still civilian. Workers still built cars, refrigerators, radios. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor ended the debate overnight. The United States did not enter the war gradually, it surged into it. Congress declared war, the public demanded action, and the government responded with an industrial effort unmatched in scale. Within weeks, the War Production Board began reshaping the economy. Automobile plants were ordered to retool, shipyards expanded, aluminum production skyrocketed. Training programs were created for workers who had never seen an aircraft blueprint before. This was not simply about building planes, it was about building systems, assembly lines, supply chains, and logistics networks capable of sustained output for years. To German planners, this mobilization was noted, but not yet feared. They had seen enemies rearm before. They assumed bottlenecks would slow production, that quality would limit quantity, that pilot skill would always offset numerical disadvantage. They did not yet understand that the United States was preparing to fight the air war not as a contest of elite pilots, but as a contest of arithmetic. And that shift would soon transform the sky itself. Long before American bombers filled European skies, the idea that wars could be decided from the air was still unproven. In the aftermath of the First World War, airpower theorists on both sides of the Atlantic argued fiercely about the future. Some believed aircraft would merely support armies on the ground. Others insisted that modern wars would be won by striking an enemy's industry, transportation, and morale directly, far behind the front lines. In the United States, one of the loudest voices belonged to Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. He argued that bombers, if built in sufficient numbers and properly protected, could cripple a nation's ability to fight. His ideas were controversial, often ridiculed, sometimes punished, but they lingered. Across the ocean, Germany took a different path. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, rearmament followed quickly. The Luftwaffe was built for speed and aggression. Its doctrine emphasized tactical bombing, close air support, and fighter dominance. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt B-109 and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka were designed to work alongside fast-moving ground forces in Poland, in France. In the early months of the war, it worked. The Luftwaffe crushed opponents through coordination and skill. Pilots became aces. Experience mattered. Individual ability mattered. Victory in the air seemed personal. Strategic bombing, long-range, high-altitude attacks on factories and cities, was ignored, but it was not central to German planning. Heavy bombers were expensive, complex, slow to build. Germany's industrial base, already stretched, could not easily support mass production on the scale required. Britain, by contrast, learned harsh lessons early. After suffering daylight losses in 1939 and 1940, the Royal Air Force shifted to night bombing. The goal was survival, not precision. Area bombing became policy. It was a grim adaptation, born of necessity. The United States watched all of this from across the Atlantic. Before December 1941, America was officially at peace, but it was not idle. The U.S. Army Air Corps studied European battles closely. Reports from Britain were analyzed line by line: loss rates, formation tactics, defensive gun placements. The Americans reached a bold conclusion. Daylight precision bombing could work if aircraft were heavily armed, flown in tight formations, and built in overwhelming numbers. This belief led directly to the development of aircraft like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. 4 engines, high ceilings, bristling with machine guns, designed not just to bomb, but to fight their way to the target and back. Still, in 1940 and early 1941, this remained theory. American industry was powerful, but it was not yet mobilized for total war. Aircraft production existed, but nothing close to what was coming. Many factories were still civilian. Workers still built cars, refrigerators, radios. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor ended the debate overnight. The United States did not enter the war gradually, it surged into it. Congress declared war, the public demanded action, and the government responded with an industrial effort unmatched in scale. Within weeks, the War Production Board began reshaping the economy. Automobile plants were ordered to retool, shipyards expanded, aluminum production skyrocketed. Training programs were created for workers who had never seen an aircraft blueprint before. This was not simply about building planes, it was about building systems, assembly lines, supply chains, and logistics networks capable of sustained output for years. To German planners, this mobilization was noted, but not yet feared. They had seen enemies rearm before. They assumed bottlenecks would slow production, that quality would limit quantity, that pilot skill would always offset numerical disadvantage. They did not yet understand that the United States was preparing to fight the air war not as a contest of elite pilots, but as a contest of arithmetic. And that shift would soon transform the sky itself. Long before American bombers filled European skies, the idea that wars could be decided from the air was still unproven. In the aftermath of the First World War, air power theorists on both sides of the Atlantic argued fiercely about the future. Some believed aircraft would merely support armies on the ground. Others insisted that modern wars would be won by striking an enemy's industry, transportation, and morale directly, far behind the front lines. In the United States, one of the loudest voices belonged to Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. He argued that bombers, if built in sufficient numbers and properly protected, could cripple a nation's ability to fight. His ideas were controversial, often ridiculed, sometimes punished, but they lingered. Across the ocean, Germany took a different path. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, rearmament followed quickly. The Luftwaffe was built for speed and aggression. Its doctrine emphasized tactical bombing, close air support, and fighter dominance. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt B-109 and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka were designed to work alongside fast-moving ground forces in Poland, in France. In the early months of the war, it worked. The Luftwaffe crushed opponents through coordination.
By 1942, the United States had begun to reveal the true scale of its mobilization. What had once been a peacetime economy was now a vast, coordinated machine. The War Production Board set priorities with sweeping authority. Steel, aluminum, rubber, fuel. Every critical material was rationed and redirected. Civilian production collapsed almost overnight. In its place rose an industrial network designed for one purpose only: sustained war. Aircraft production became the centerpiece. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 6,000 military aircraft. By 1942, that number surged past 47,000. In 1943, it would exceed 85,000. These were not projections, they were completed machines, delivered, tested, and flown. The most striking symbol of this transformation stood in Michigan. Ford's Willow Run plant was unlike anything aviation had ever seen. It stretched over 3 million square feet. Aircraft were not handcrafted by specialists. They moved down mile-long assembly lines. Parts arrived by rail and conveyor. Tasks were broken down into repeatable steps. Workers, many of them women, many with no prior industrial experience, were trained to perform them with speed and precision. By late 1944, Willow Run was producing a completed B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. This was not an anomaly. Similar facilities appeared across California, Washington, Kansas, and Texas. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, Lockheed, in North American aviation expanded relentlessly. Subcontractors multiplied. Engines from Pratt & Whitney, turrets from Bendix, instruments from dozens of specialized firms. Nothing stood alone. Every component was standardized, interchangeable, replaceable. The effect was cumulative. When one factory slowed, another compensated. When shortages appeared, alternatives were found. When designs failed, revisions were absorbed into the system without stopping the line. For the men who would fly these bombers, training expanded just as rapidly. Airfields appeared across the American South and Midwest. Cadets learned navigation, formation flying, gunnery, and bombing techniques at a pace never before attempted. Losses were anticipated. Replacement crews were planned for in advance. Across the Atlantic, Germany watched with growing unease. Intelligence reports filtered back through neutral countries, intercepted communications, and aerial reconnaissance. They spoke of enormous factories, of round-the-clock shifts, of output numbers that strained belief. German analysts calculated possible exaggeration. Surely these figures were inflated. Surely production would slow. But by mid-1943, there was no denying what was happening in the skies over Europe. American bombers began appearing in numbers that defied previous experience. They came in tight formations, stacked in altitude, stretching from horizon to horizon. If one bomber was shot down, another slid into its place. If several fell, the formation closed ranks and continued. German fighter pilots noticed something unsettling. The same aircraft types kept returning. New serial numbers, fresh paint, crews that looked younger each month. Losses that would have crippled other air forces barely slowed the American advance. Behind this lay a fundamental difference in philosophy. German aircraft production, constrained by bombing, material shortages, and administrative chaos, struggled to keep pace. Skilled labor was scarce. Designs changed frequently. Production lines were disrupted. To the United States, by contrast, embraced repetition. The same bomber, built the same way, again and again. Volume became a weapon. By late 1943, American planners were no longer asking whether they could sustain daylight bombing over Germany. They were asking how fast they could escalate it. And in the Luftwaffe, among men who had once ruled the air through experience and precision, a new realization took hold. This was no longer a war of attrition in the traditional sense. It was a war of replacement. And that realization would be felt most sharply by those facing the bombers head-on. The war in the air began far from the sky. Inside American factories, the rhythm was constant. Rivet guns hammered. Conveyor belts moved without pause. Shift whistles marked time more reliably than clocks. Workers arrived before dawn and left after dark, often 6 or 7 days a week. Many had never seen an airplane up close before the war. Farmers from the Midwest, office clerks, teenagers fresh out of school. Women, in unprecedented numbers, filled roles once reserved for skilled tradesmen. They learned quickly, one task, then another, then the next. They did not see the front lines. They saw blueprints, inspection stamps, serial numbers. But each completed bomber carried a quiet understanding. This machine would soon cross an ocean and enter combat. Efficiency mattered more than individuality. The system did not rely on heroics, it relied on consistency. Mistakes were documented, processes refined, output increased. A single worker might spend an entire shift installing the same component thousands of times. The work was repetitive, exhausting, but it was also measurable. Progress could be counted in units completed per hour. That arithmetic mattered. Thousands of miles away, young airmen climbed aboard the machines built by strangers they would never meet. A B-17 crew numbered 10. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, gunners stationed in nose, waist, tail, and dorsal positions. Each depended on the others. Each depended on the aircraft itself. Their missions were long, often 8 hours or more. At altitude, temperatures dropped well below freezing. Oxygen masks were mandatory. Frostbite was common. Fear was constant. They flew knowing the statistics. They knew how many missions constituted a tour, They knew how many crews failed to complete it. Losses were not hidden. Empty bunks told the story plainly. Yet replacements arrived steadily. New crews, new aircraft. The flow never stopped. When a bomber failed to return, another was already scheduled to take its place. The bomber itself became an instrument of strategy. It was not elegant, it was not fast, but it was durable. Redundant systems allowed damaged aircraft to limp home. Defensive firepower suggested safety in numbers. Tight formations multiplied that effect. What mattered most was not perfection, but availability. If an aircraft was lost, another followed. If 10 were lost, 20 arrived. The production lines absorbed the cost. In this equation, the bomber was no longer a rare asset, it was a consumable one. And that reality, once fully understood, would soon confront those trying desperately to stop them.
For the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, the change was impossible to ignore. In the early years of the war, German aces had thrived. Experience accumulated, victory tallies rose. Men like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders became symbols of mastery. Skill mattered. Survivability increased with time in combat. By 1943, that equation began to collapse. American bomber streams were not fragile targets. They were moving fortresses. Attacking them required repeated, dangerous passes through concentrated defensive fire. Even successful attacks often ended with damaged fighters and wounded pilots. More unsettling was the scale. A pilot might shoot down a bomber, sometimes two, and still watch the formation continue unchanged. The psychological reward of victory diminished. The sense of impact vanished. Intelligence officers briefed fighter units with updated estimates of American production. The numbers were staggering. Replacement aircraft appeared faster than victories could be claimed. One German ace reportedly summarized the problem simply: destroying bombers no longer felt like stopping the enemy, it felt like slowing a machine that did not notice resistance. At higher levels, the implications were worse. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots at a rate it could not replace. Training programs were shortened, fuel shortages limited flight hours. New pilots entered combat with minimal experience, facing opponents protected by numbers and improving escorts. Aircraft production inside Germany increased in 1944, but it came too late and under constant bombardment. Factories moved underground, output fragmented, coordination suffered. Leadership faced a brutal calculation: protect industry or preserve pilots. Both were failing. Meanwhile, American losses, though heavy, were absorbed without structural collapse. Perhaps the greatest impact was moral. German pilots began to speak of endless bombers, of skies that seemed permanently occupied, of returning from combat only to hear engines overhead again the next day. The realization spread quietly. This was not a battle that could be won by courage alone. The enemy was not just in the cockpit, it was in the factory, in the schedules, in the numbers that kept growing. And that understanding set the stage for the moment when the air war reached its breaking point.
By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe entered a phase neither side could ignore. American planners believed the time had come to strike deep into the German industrial heartland. The targets were no longer coastal ports or rail yards in occupied territory. They were ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil facilities, nodes without which the German war economy could not function. One target stood out above all others: Schweinfurt. On August 17, 1943, hundreds of B-17s lifted off from airfields across eastern England. Their destination lay far beyond the range of Allied fighter escorts. This was a calculated risk. The bombers would have to fight their way in and out alone. The formations stretched for miles. Above them, the sky was clear. Below, German radar stations tracked every movement. As the bombers crossed into Germany, the Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. Fighters attacked in waves, head-on passes, rockets, cannon fire, the air filled with smoke, debris, and parachutes. Losses mounted quickly. By the time the surviving bombers reached Schweinfurt, formations were ragged but intact enough to drop their payloads. Ball-bearing factories were hit, fires burned, but the cost was staggering. 60 B-17s were destroyed that day. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. The Americans had proven they could reach the target. They had also proven the price was unsustainable. A second Schweinfurt mission in October confirmed it. Again, factories were damaged. Again, losses were severe. Daylight bombing without long-range escort could not continue at that cost. For a brief moment, it appeared the Luftwaffe had found the formula to stop the bomber offensive. But beneath the surface, a deeper shift was already underway. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. This time, the goal was not just factories, it was the Luftwaffe itself. Massive bomber raids were coordinated with improved escort coverage. American fighters pushed farther than ever before. German interceptors were forced into battle repeatedly, day after day. Each engagement drained something Germany could not replace easily: experienced pilots. Aircraft could be built, pilots could not. Losses accumulated. Squadrons were rotated, reformed, then shattered again. Training pipelines broke under the strain. The air battles of Big Week did not end the Luftwaffe outright, but they bent it past recovery. And yet, one final factor still remained unresolved. The bombers were coming in greater numbers than ever before. What changed everything was not just attrition, it was reach. And that reach was about to extend all the way to Berlin.
The final shift came with an aircraft that did not carry bombs. The North American P-51 Mustang was not the first American fighter of the war, but it became the most decisive. With its long range, fuel efficiency, and high-altitude performance, it could do what earlier escorts could not: stay with the bombers from takeoff to target and back again. By early 1944, Mustangs equipped with drop tanks began accompanying bomber streams deep into Germany. There were no safe gaps anymore, no moments when German fighters could attack unopposed. For the Luftwaffe, the change was immediate and brutal. Interceptor units that once waited for the bombers now found themselves hunted. Mustangs swept ahead, above and behind the formations. They attacked airfields, they attacked climbing fighters, they attacked aircraft as they attempted to land. The balance of attrition reversed. German pilots now faced a choice: engage bombers under escort and suffer heavy losses, or avoid combat and allow targets to be destroyed. Either option accelerated defeat. The mathematics were merciless. American factories continued producing bombers and fighters in quantities that dwarfed German output. Losses that would have grounded operations elsewhere were absorbed without pause. Damaged aircraft were replaced. Fallen crews were replaced. Germany could not do the same. Fuel shortages worsened. Training hours fell further. New pilots arrived to the front with less than half the experience of those they replaced. Veteran aces were spread thin, trying to hold collapsing units together. By late spring 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of sustained resistance over much of Germany. Bomber streams reached their targets with increasing regularity. Berlin itself was struck repeatedly in daylight. German commanders understood what this meant. Without air superiority, ground forces would be exposed, industry would be crippled. Any future defensive operations would be conducted under constant attack from above. The decisive moment had passed, not with a single battle, but with a realization. The United States and its allies had solved the equation of industrial air war.
They could lose aircraft and crews and still grow stronger. Germany could not. From that point forward, the outcome in the air was no longer in doubt. What remained was to measure the cost and to understand what this imbalance of production ultimately did to the war itself.
By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that had once dominated Europe. Its aircraft still flew, its pilots still fought, but the structure that sustained them was breaking down. Losses told the story clearly. Between January and May 1944, German fighter units suffered catastrophic attrition. Experienced pilots, men with years of combat knowledge, were killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs collapsed under fuel shortages and constant disruption. New pilots reached the front with minimal flight hours, often entering combat after only basic instruction. American losses, by contrast, remained high but manageable. Bomber crews continued to be shot down, fighters were destroyed, but the replacement system absorbed the impact. Fresh aircraft arrived daily. Training bases in the United States kept producing new crews at a steady pace. This imbalance reshaped the sky. German interceptors increasingly avoided large formations. Some units were held back to defend critical areas, others simply lacked the strength to engage. Missions that once would have triggered massive aerial battles now encountered scattered resistance. On the ground, the consequences multiplied. Factories damaged by bombing struggled to recover. Transportation networks frayed. Fuel production, already strained, fell sharply under sustained attacks on refineries. Even when aircraft were available, there was often not enough fuel to fly them. Reports from inside Germany reflected growing alarm. Luftwaffe commanders warned that air superiority was slipping beyond reach. Intelligence assessments acknowledged that American production far exceeded earlier estimates. One internal report noted that enemy losses no longer translated into operational relief. Bombers returned the next day in greater numbers. Fighter escorts grew stronger, not weaker. By June 1944, the strategic impact became unmistakable. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, German units in France operated under constant aerial surveillance and attack. Movements by day became nearly impossible. Reinforcements were delayed or destroyed en route. The air war had shifted from contest to condition. Air superiority was no longer something to be achieved, it was something the Allies already possessed. And that dominance traced directly back to the industrial decisions made years earlier, decisions that transformed aircraft into an inexhaustible resource. The final consequences of that transformation would soon be felt not just in the air, but across the entire European battlefield. The collapse of Luftwaffe resistance reshaped the final year of the war in Europe. By late 1944, Allied bombers flew virtually unopposed across the skies of Germany. Cities, rail yards, and factories were struck repeatedly. German aircraft factories, once productive, were now scattered, camouflaged, or hidden underground, but they could not keep pace. The United States alone was producing thousands of aircraft per month. Every bomber lost in combat was replaced almost immediately, often with a newer, slightly improved model. Pilots were replenished through a pipeline that had been honed into a precision instrument of war. The human toll on Germany was severe. Veteran pilots, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, were either killed, captured, or injured beyond return. Training programs were rushed, leaving inexperienced airmen to face the most dangerous air campaign in history. Morale plummeted. Reports from the Eastern and Western fronts reflected a growing sense of inevitability. The sky no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. Statistical records make the scale clear. During the bombing campaigns from 1943 to 1945, the USAAF alone lost roughly 45,000 aircrew and 18,000 aircraft. In Germany, fighter losses were catastrophic. Some Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader reported losing over 50% of their experienced pilots in a single year.
By contrast, American and British production replaced losses faster than the Luftwaffe could respond. The psychological impact extended beyond statistics. German civilians witnessed the relentless arrival of bombers. Cities were struck repeatedly, sometimes by formations numbering hundreds. Disbelief turned to dread. Even German commanders admitted that no single victory against the bomber offensive could alter the larger strategic reality. Internally, German military reports emphasized an uncomfortable truth. The enemy's strength was not just in the air, it was in the factories, in the assembly lines. One memo bluntly concluded that the loss of aircraft and pilots was now inevitable, and that defensive efforts could only delay the outcome, not reverse it. Leadership faced an impossible calculation: conserve pilots and let bombs fall, or sacrifice the remaining experienced airmen to contest every raid. By the spring of 1945, Germany's industrial and military systems were overstretched to the breaking point. Allied air supremacy allowed ground forces to advance with relative freedom, disrupting supply lines and crippling German defensive operations. The air war, which had begun as a struggle of skill and strategy, ended as a demonstration of the unassailable power of sustained industrial capacity. The consequences were not only tactical, they were existential. The relentless production of aircraft, the replacement of crews, and the coordinated strategy of Allied bombing campaigns turned industrial might into a decisive weapon, one the Luftwaffe simply could not match. The Germans had once ruled the skies with skill and audacity. By 1944, they were losing them to arithmetic. This inevitability leads us to reflect on the broader significance of a bomber built every hour and the way it changed warfare forever.
The story of a bomber built every hour is not merely one of machines or statistics. It is a story of scale, of human ingenuity transformed into relentless output, of war redefined by production lines instead of dogfights. In the skies over Europe, skill and courage remained vital. Pilots still faced mortal danger. Crews endured freezing altitudes, flak, and enemy fighters. But no matter how brave or skilled, their efforts were eventually measured against an industrial tide that would not stop. The factory, the assembly line, the organized labor force all became as potent a weapon as any cannon or fighter plane. The United States proved that warfare could be waged through numbers as much as tactics. An army of aircraft, continuously replaced, could absorb losses that would cripple any other air force. And yet it was not only the machines that mattered, it was the vision behind them. Standardization, coordination, and foresight turned raw materials into overwhelming power. Each bomber that rolled off the line was a statement. The war could be sustained indefinitely. For Germany, it was a cruel calculus. The Luftwaffe's finest pilots, once symbols of dominance, found themselves fighting against an enemy whose strength lay not in the air, but in the factories they could not destroy. The moral weight, the psychological strain, and the inevitable attrition became as deadly as any bullet or shell. Ultimately, the lesson of a bomber built every hour extends beyond the Second World War. It shows how industry can shape conflict, how the rhythm of assembly lines can dictate the fate of nations, and how technological and logistical mastery can redefine the rules of engagement. In the end, victory in war is not only decided on the battlefield, it is decided where the machines are born, where strategy meets scale, and where human perseverance meets relentless production. The skies had shifted. Skill could no longer fight arithmetic, and the war would never be the same again.